and an affiliate of the Seeger Center. Janet Steele, who's the director of the Seeger Center, wasn't able to be here today, so I'm standing in for her. And this talk is a product of a relationship that has been developed between the Seeger Center and the Southeast Asia Forum, which is based in Washington, D.C. and led by Bill Wise. We'll be having 3 talks this semester, and we're really thrilled to have this partnership, which brings us wonderful speakers and also an audience that extends beyond GW. So thank you all for being here, and I wanted to thank Adam for everything he did to put this event together. Adam is amazing, and everything just works seamlessly when he's involved, so thank you, Adam. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Wise to introduce our speaker.
Okay, I will not only introduce the speaker if you have a minute, but introduce the subject, our subject today a little bit. But in any case, good afternoon. Welcome to you all coming here on a dismal day like this is a testament to how important Southeast Asia remains. The dismality of the day you can offset by the realization brought to my attention this morning that 3 weeks from today or yesterday or tomorrow, 3 weeks from now, it's the first day of spring. And at the rate we are changing our climate, it's likely the real first day of spring is going to be very soon because it's an awfully mild winter. In any case, as Christina said, my name is Bill Wise. I chair the Southeast Asia Forum. We're an independent organization, not affiliated with any other organization that exists solely to push forward the goal of promoting the study of Southeast Asia at colleges, universities, and research institutes in the Mid-Atlantic region and as far beyond as we can get. We began thinking that we were going to do these kinds of things all the time, but our choice for a start date, January 1, 2020, was, to say the least, inopportune. And so I learned how to spell Zoom, 2 O's, and we have lived a lot in the shadows of the internet for the last 4 years. Now we are kind of out in the real world, and we intend, as Professor Fink said, we intend to do things like this here and elsewhere as much as we can for as long as we can. This is a really good partnership that we have with the Seeger Center. And today's event is the first in a series of 3, as Professor Fink said. What she didn't say is she is going to do a conversation with YY Noob, a Burmese activist from the Rohingya community, on Tuesday, March 26th, more or less the same time. For those of you who feel crammed in, more or less the same place, but we will gradually emerge to larger areas. But we hope you'll join us for that important event on March 26th. But today our seminar focuses on a fundamental issue in Southeast Asia, how states in the region manage their relationship with China and the United States. Not a small task. From our perch here in Washington, obviously relations between the US and China are, shall we say, to be generous, rocky. Closing in on frigid, perhaps not ever getting there, but closing in on frigid. And our question du jour is, what does all this mean for the 10 states of Southeast Asia? Because when tensions rise between 2 major powers that both have interests in Southeast Asia, fears also rise in Southeast Asia, fears that somehow Southeast Asia will be drawn into choosing sides, or even worse, embroiled in a conflict not of their nature. So this is a really important issue for Southeast Asians, and one that is important for the United States to address. But it's also important to remember that this isn't the only issue on Southeast Asia's table. There are lots of important things that Southeast Asians are concerned about that don't begin with China, US. So we'll, in subsequent seminars, we're going to address some of these other subjects more unique to Southeast Asia, but this is the big deal. This is big for all of us. To manage it, most Southeast Asian states try to find a way to balance major powers and to hedge their bets. I'm using words from IR 101 with apologies, because I never actually cared for IR 101. But the goal is to maintain their autonomy in a dangerous place and in a dangerous world. And that bears some attention, or calls for some attention from us. How these states can safely navigate between and retain their sovereignty and security between major powers in a time of rising tensions is a real interesting subject. So we are I think we're on the right track there. There are three brief points I want you to consider as we start, though. First, Southeast Asians are not new to this game of working with major powers. Anybody know why? Why I would say that?
British and Dutch colonialism.
Not to mention French and American. But yes, they are all 9 of the 10 Southeast Asian states were colonies of other countries. So and some going back 400 years. So there is a real experience factor at play here. What's another reason, other than colonialism, more recent and more pertinent? I don't know, anybody ever heard of the Vietnam War? Southeast Asia was a major conflict point during the Cold War between the United States and Russia, and the semi-Cold War between the United States and China. So Southeast Asians have been here before, and one should not forget that this is not news. Second, although we will talk about the Southeast Asians think this and the Southeast Asians think that, they are not one in their viewpoints. There are many viewpoints in the 10 countries of the region. Particularly, they are not singular in their perception of the threat posed by China or the threat posed by the United States, nor singular in a view about the benefits that accrue to the region from relationships with China and the United States. So there are many voices, many differences of viewpoint within and among these states. We're kind of got a bold subject, so we are probably going to generalize a little bit, but bear in mind that there are lots of reasons. Why would this be? Anybody have any idea why there are such diverse viewpoints? Am I right?
I think a big reason is.
Wait a minute, you can answer all the, did you get elected to? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think a big reason is geographic proximity to strategic points. The Philippines is a good example, with key areas in the Spratlys being contested much more than say Cambodia's entitlements.
Okay. How many countries in Southeast Asia actually have a border with China? The answer is yes. Go ahead. Yes, you got it. Oh, this is a very advanced classroom. Yeah, it's geography, it's political relationships, economic relationships, the ethnic makeup of states. All of these things are different in the 10 countries. So all have a different way of answering the question, how do we perceive China and the US? And lastly, obviously, we think Southeast Asia is an important region. That's why we study it. And that it deserves the full attention of policymakers, both in Washington and Beijing. But alas, that is not so. Because why does my sense of the importance of Southeast Asia is not mirrored in the White House or in Beijing? It's really important to realize that major powers have a lot on their plate. They have domestic, political, and economic issues. They have crises of various sorts around the world. They have wars. In the case of Washington right now, 2 wars in which the the United States is actively engaged, although not a combatant. So there are reasons why some regions get less attention, get, as they might say in the region, swept aside. This offers opportunities, but it also, for some states, but it also offers real disadvantages for others. So, and I might say that this very moment in history had a faltering Chinese economy. It takes much of Xi Jinping's attention and a crazy, this is a scientific term, but a crazy election in the United States that takes a lot of our president's time and interest. So there are good reasons why places like Southeast Asia get sort of glittering attention from the major powers. We are not always on their radar, and they are definitely not always on ours. So to discuss this mess, this US, Southeast Asia, China collection of problems, we have a very distinguished analyst whom I have known for a number of years. Prashanth Parameswaran is a, well, in fact, his sort of bio is not only on the notice we sent out, but it's right in front of you. So I won't go through it in detail. I urge you to read the handout though that has his bio because it's very impressive. But I did want to point out item 2 on that list because Prashanth publishes, or he runs a very interesting Southeast Asia hub, and he publishes a weekly newsletter on what's going on in the region with excellent analysis. And if you have a paper to write in a Southeast Asia class, or even if you're just interested in Southeast Asia, his is a go-to stop. And although he will not appreciate me saying this, perhaps it's pretty much free unless you have a charge account, which you can upgrade, but it's a good place. Were this existed when had it existed when I was a student, I would have loved it. But I do today as well. And lastly, let me just say that this is, although it doesn't look like it because of the way we're clustered here, this is a seminar, not a lecture. So we encourage your participation. Yours has been excellent. Now, if you would take the mantle and pass it to the person next to you, either side, that would be great because we want you even to interrupt if you have a very important point to make or a very important question to ask. We want this to be interactive, not us to you. So Prashanth will make a brief presentation. He and I will have a short conversation after that, and then we will go to more formal questions. But if you want to intervene, the ball is in your proverbial court. So unless there are any early comments or questions, let's get started. Prashanth?
Well, thanks a lot, Professor Weiss and Professor Pink. I guess Professor Weiss was being a little bit humble in his introduction there, because when I first got started on Southeast Asia and looking at Southeast Asia and US policy, he was incredibly generous with his time, sharing his expertise and offering insights about my career. And Professor Pink, in my capacity at the Foreign Service Institute, teaching there at the State Department, she's provided all sorts of insights and expert views over the years, which makes my job much easier when I can actually bring in experts on individual countries, sectors, and areas in Southeast Asia. Because as Professor Weiss correctly said, I mean, this is a very diverse region, right? If you include East Timor or Timor-Leste, this is 11 countries, about 700 million people, 5th largest economy in the world, the center of key straits, including the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea. This is also an incredibly young population. So for me, as somebody who studies the region, I find it most interesting to update my information when I go to all of these regional capitals, but also talking to people that are outside of the elite circles. Because I think in some of these countries, you do have, and Professor Weiss alluded to this, some governments that are, a little bit more elite focused, sometimes a little less democratic. And so it is really important to also engage the people of these countries rather than just the elites. And of course, people who studied in the US and the UK and all these places who already share a lot of the views that we have here in Washington. Otherwise, we're just kind of in an echo chamber. So I'll go ahead and just say a few things about how I came to this topic. Frankly speaking, my focus on Southeast Asia is primarily on security, foreign policy, geopolitics, and geoeconomics. My book that I wrote a couple of years back that was released as everything amid COVID, it's kind of a a blur when exactly I did this and everything, but it was on looking at US commitment to Southeast Asia. Because I think as we are talking about this topic of US-China competition, I do think this is a very Washington perspective about even framing the conversation. What I hear when I go to Southeast Asia is two separate conversations. One conversation about China, which has made significant inroads economically in the region, remains, if you look at the survey statistics from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, among elites in Southeast Asia, China is already the top economic partner in Southeast Asia. It is also seen increasingly a majority of the population, and this is elites, by the way. If you ask the population, you might get a whole different set of views, already seen as the major political and strategic partner in the region. So China is not, it may have been an economic conversation 15, 20 years ago. It's not really an economic conversation now in Southeast Asia. It is across multiple domains. But China also remains the most, well, I should say, least trusted or most untrustworthy power in Southeast Asia, even as it's building a lot of this influence. The conversation on the United States is different. I think there's a lot of goodwill in Southeast Asia in terms of the United States, recognizing it as a power that has kept a lot of the security and order in the region, particularly among elites. But the US legacy, as Professor Weiss pointed out in his introduction, is quite mixed in Southeast Asia. I think in some countries, the United States, did not have so much of a direct influence. In other countries, the US was a colonial power like the Philippines. In other cases, the United States was dropping, bombs on countries like Laos, and a lot of the legacies are still being lived by the people of these countries still today. So you're going to get very different perceptions on the United States. But I would say in aggregate, the focus of my book was looking at how the United States has tried multiple times to be focused and committed on Southeast Asia. But every time it tries to do so, there's always a major threat or a major challenge that kind of dominates the prism through which it views Southeast Asia. So the Vietnam War, as Professor Weiss pointed out, it was the case in the 1960s, 70s. Then the US was preoccupied by competition with Japan in the 1980s. After the Cold War, the United States was focused more on sort of this notion of a neoliberal economic order and promoting institutions. But then you had 9/11, and then the focus on the war on terrorism. And now you have China, which is kind of the big prism through which we view the region. And I'm always struck how much we talk about that prism here in Washington, and how much when I go to the region, people tell me to stop thinking about that prism, and how the United States is thinking too much about that prism. So I just wanted to put that caveat out there as we're talking about this topic. How we talk about it here in Washington is very different from how it's talked about in regional capitals. So that being said, I'll share a few slides for a few minutes, and then maybe we can get into a little bit of a conversation. So I'll sort of touch on three particular things. One is making sure we keep this competition in perspective. Second, a little bit about regional realities. And then third, what are the policy implications for the US? And here I want to be quite brief, because I think we can get into this in the Q&A, but also, a number of you might have recommendations as well about how we move forward. You work in the space, but also, whether you're immersed in the Washington bubble or not immersed in the Washington bubble, you may have different perceptions and views about how we approach this subject. So three takeaways. I'm not going to go through this too much because Professor Weiss has provided an exact summation. I think we agree on the broad points here about in terms of making sure we don't view the region through a binary lens of US-China competition. I think when I'm in the region talking to policymakers, they're talking about a multipolar region. And in that sense, it's not so much the strict kind of definitional parameters around international relations about military capabilities and economic power, but more along the lines of, if you look over the past few months, Japan just held a commemorative summit with ASEAN that was immensely successful in December. Australia is going to be doing one with ASEAN and Southeast Asia in general next week. The European Union just hosted a major Southeast Asia summit just a couple of weeks ago. So if we just think about this as us versus China, we really are doing a grave injustice to the actual realities on which major powers are engaging the region. The second is, I think I'm very wary of this conception of hedging. I see it a lot in the literature. I'm very familiar with it. But I don't hear a lot about this binary choice when I'm in Southeast Asia about, we're gonna meet with the US on Wednesday, and then we're gonna meet on China on Friday, and then on Tuesday, we'll meet with the Japanese and we'll be balanced. Nobody thinks about it this way in practice, right? It is an interesting analytical concept for us to think about it, but I think when we're actually getting to what policymakers are concerned about, they are more concerned about what every power can do for their political realities, their economic realities, about their economic future of their countries. That's the primary focus. And if the US can do something, great. If Japan can do something, great. If Brazil can do something, fantastic, right? That is the prism through which the region views this sort of competition. And then I think the third part, and we can get into this in the Q&A. I mean, I think there is a tendency, and I've said this is historical. It's not one particular administration or another, but to view particular regions of the world and particular countries through the major challenge of the day. So terrorism, or now China. So one of the things we hear about is, Indonesia and Vietnam are key swing states, in US-China competition. And I think it's really, it would do us good to sort of think about what do we mean when we think about oscillations or swings in these countries, because these countries don't think about, they're in some sort of swing in the playground, and they're in Washington for 2003, and then they're in Beijing in 2024. It's more about how they balance their domestic, regional, and global aspirations and their particular realities. So I'll briefly go through this. I've already talked through this, and Professor Weiss has summarized this, very adeptly. But basically every decade in Southeast Asia, there's some change in the competitive landscape. It could be the sort of withdrawal from the British in the 1970s, the rise of Japan in the 80s, the end of the Cold War, war on terrorism, China's rise, and now US-China competition. So competition is very granular. It's also something that changes very quickly, and it's quite dynamic in Southeast Asia. And then I think in terms of contours of competition, as Professor Weiss summed up really well, I mean, I think it is really important for us to think about, if you're a leader in any one of these Southeast Asian countries and you're going to sleep at night, you're not going to sleep thinking about how am I going to balance, US-China competition. You are thinking about, your political party is in power, or in the case of Myanmar, you've just taken over in a military coup. The country is basically in chaos. You have basically an active sort of armed resistance against you. The international community is isolating you. These countries are not thinking about what happens in Washington, and the Indo-Pacific economic framework. That's not what these countries are thinking about urgently. There are domestic considerations, but there's also sub-regional parts of this as well. So if you find yourself in Laos, for example, Laos is thinking about balancing not in the context of just US and China. They're also thinking about how to balance in the context of bigger neighbors like Vietnam, like Thailand, right? Other countries. So there's a sub-regional balance to these considerations that sometimes gets overlooked when we think about the aggregate sort of US-China competition. And then there's other boundary disputes, which I kind of won't go into, that these countries don't like to talk about, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. It's the flip side of the fact that the Southeast Asians did not, like we saw in Europe, kill each other in major cross-continental wars that envelop themselves in world wars. But it doesn't mean that those disputes don't exist, right? They do exist. And so sometimes when the Southeast Asian countries are talking about the United States and China, the audience, if Singapore is talking about US-China competition, might be Malaysia or Indonesia as much as it is Beijing or Washington. And that's really important for us to keep in mind, because that's not captured in the public rhetoric of these leaders and what they're actually sort of saying. I think the second point I want to make is, when we're thinking about US-China competition and the role of the United States and China, I do think we need to take into account the fact that both Washington and Beijing have their own strengths and weaknesses. And I'll talk a little bit about what this is from the US side. I think we have a lot of strengths in terms of our security presence, which is really well appreciated. The United States, I think, still has a lot of, what Joe and I used to call soft power, right? But I do think we also have some limitations. I think our system in which we separate our private sector from what we do with our universities, what we do in governments, is a different model than China has, but also, frankly, a different model from how the Southeast Asian governments have it too. So when we say that we're engaging economically, but go talk to our companies, that's not something our government is doing. For Southeast Asian governments, that's very different from engaging with China or Japan or South. It's not just China, Japan, South Korea, and these countries where there actually is a lot of a closer collaboration. And that's not, sort of a necessarily an overt weakness of the US, but it is a limitation because we need to think about messaging and our narrative as an integrated set of actors, which is very difficult to do in this divisive political environment that we're in with an election approaching. But I think that is a very significant component of how we sort of think about that. And I also think, one other thing I would point out is the flip side of our active security presence in Southeast Asia is that there tends to be a lot of over militarization in terms of how we talk about things. I mean, and part of that is a consequence of resourcing, and DoD just has a lot more funding than, say, the State Department and other bureaucracies. And that, sometimes we're messaging our military presence, but that's actually the least thing that Southeast Asian countries want to hear from. So it is a problem that we repeatedly see in US policy, and I mentioned this extensively in the book. You have to, when you're thinking about what you're supplying, you also need to think about how that matches with what countries are demanding. So the supply side needs to match the demand side. And I think sometimes we don't really do a good job of aligning that in particular case because of our domestic. I just included a few perspectives here because even though I do talk to policymakers and other officials, I can't really include them on the record. But I think even if you look at these public statements, they give you a good flavor of how different countries think about competition in Southeast Asia. And my favorite one is actually what Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, who's going to be stepping down later this year, said about strategic competition, which is, even though to the US, China is a strategic competitor, Asian countries are not competing with China. So their challenge is actually to get the most opportunities out of China, but limit the challenges that they have with Beijing. That's their challenge. And to do the same with Washington and to manage that competition for their own interests. They're not actively in this competition. So when we see it as we're kind of recruiting people to come into this kind of competition with us, there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of how we view it here in Washington and how it's viewed in the region. So a big part of what I try to do, and a lot of this is in a paper that I published with the Wilson Center recently in December, looking at strategic competition and this notion of how do we think about agency by Southeast Asian states in US-China competition. And I came up with sort of 3 ways of thinking about this and different ways in which different Southeast Asian countries are doing it. I think the one that people often talk the most about is kind of the balancing piece, right? So look at the US and you're doing too much with China, you want to bring in Japan, you want to bring in South Korea, so on and so forth. I think that's probably the one that you hear a lot about. But actually, there are a lot more granular conversations that are happening in the region. If you look at a country like Singapore, Singapore is not looking to just balance. Singapore is looking to shape the broader regional and global architecture around which this entire conversation is occurring. So they're coming up with digital agreements, green agreements, even as here in Washington, it's tough for us to talk about free trade. Trade hasn't stopped in Southeast Asia. Trade hasn't stopped in the Indo-Pacific region. And these countries are doing a lot in this space. One other one that I mentioned earlier is one of the consequences of US-China competition is that the neighborhoods in which the Southeast Asian countries are living in is becoming much more contested. And one good example of that is the Mekong sub-region, where countries like Thailand and Vietnam are coming up with, sometimes quietly, new unilateral mechanisms to engage with countries like Laos and Cambodia because they're afraid of what China is doing in the Mekong sub-region, and they don't want a region that is shaped by either China or the US or any one power. So these countries are developing their own mechanisms very creatively and actively, and that is also something that we need to recognize. Another part of the conversation that doesn't get a lot of public attention, but I can assure you is still very much at play in the region is the very contested notion around the information space. Lots of cyber attacks that are happening in Southeast Asia. Some of them countries are not willing to attribute very openly as to what's going on, but I think we know who the major actors are. But countries are coming up with new legislation, new policies to kind of manage their information environment as well. Some of these have very unfortunate consequences for people in the democracy and human rights and civil society space because these countries will say they're talking about foreign interference, but then they will use that to crack down on opposition movements or civil society. So when we are talking about encouraging conversations about foreign interference, we want to be very careful about thinking about the China challenge, but also how this affects the domestic politics in these particular countries, particularly in semi-democratic or authoritarian government settings. And that's a very important battlefield, but I think one that has not gotten as much attention as it should. And I hope we see a lot more work in this domain. I'll sort of end this, my last slide, on implications for US Southeast Asia strategy. And my main takeaway from writing my book, which is called Elusive Balances, kind of shaping US Southeast Asia strategy, is that we spent a lot of time in this town thinking about balance of power. And I think we need to do more of a job of thinking through balance of commitment. So thinking about how we spend our resources and how our influence translates into the actual things that we are providing to particular countries, as well as the region as a whole. So a lot of that is about how we think about our power, but also how it relates to how we translate that to threat perceptions and then our state capacity, managing the amount of resources we have. And that affects, not just how we think about our military presence. It affects how we think about diplomacy, how we think about democracy and human rights, but also how do we balance these things? I mean, the guns versus butter approach that you hear in sort of the economics classes, right? So if we're over militarized, how do we do more on the economic side? We need to talk about values, but we also, in a region like Southeast Asia in particular, particularly in a situation like this for us, we need to be a little bit more humble about acknowledging our own democratic challenges at home. Otherwise, we come across as being overly arrogant and also, frankly, very devoid of regional context in which these conversations happen. And I can assure you, in all of these countries, younger people and new generations are going to be asking their own questions about governance, about democracy, and about human rights. And so the US has to play a very delicate balancing act between supporting these indigenous sources that are promoting better governance, but also not getting too ahead of that conversation when you become a problem or a challenge, rather than actually helping these movements that are actually happening on the ground. It's a very tough challenge. But thankfully, I'm at the Wilson Center and I'm writing about this and not in the White House actually making policy. So I can actually say this, and Professor Weiss was in government actually dealing with these issues. So I recognize that it's very easy to talk about this, much harder to do. But I do think it is our responsibility and duty as scholars to keep in mind that this is a very delicate and very challenging balance. And the final point I'll sort of make in this is, I do think that part of this is about our own China policy and what we're doing. But I do think we are having a domestic conversation about how much do we think about China and how much do we think about ourselves and investing in ourselves and our own strengths and managing our own limitations and weaknesses. And I think if I were to say where we're doing less rather than when we're doing more, I think we could do a lot more in terms of having a more granular conversation about how do we leverage our strengths and how do we package this in a very compelling narrative. One thing I keep saying when I go to Southeast Asia is we're doing all of these great projects, capacity building, assistance. When I talk to the people who I went to high school with or middle school with in parts of Southeast Asia, nobody knows about these programs. They think about, I keep hearing China as the economic power and US as security power, but actually the US has been doing a tremendous amount in terms of capacity building, development assistance, and still is doing quite a lot. But we often don't let our messaging sort of be amplified as much and don't do a good job of doing it, in part because I think we think, well, we're doing it and people will recognize our good work. But I can assure you, if we're talking about strategic competition, as with, other things in life, including my own newsletter, no one's going to do your own marketing for you. You got to go there and you have to be aggressive about promoting it. Otherwise, you're letting others shape the narrative. And I think that often happens with US policy. We rely on trusted interlocutors, other academics to kind of say, here's what the US is doing indirectly. But more and more countries, including our own allies, Japan, the European Union, lots of op-eds going out, strategic communications about what they're doing and how important it is for populations. And just because the United States is a superpower doesn't mean we don't need to do our own homework in terms of that strategic communications. And narrative. So I'll end there and look forward to the discussion and the questions with Professor Weiss and, hopefully it's not too much of a grilling and.
No rubber hoses today. Well, thank you very much, Prashanth. That was excellent.
I'll take out this very crude graphic.
You've given us quite a bit to think about, and but I want to, just make two quick comments. The first is, I think 2024, at least the way it's begun, may be the year when the United States truly demonstrates its humility. I fear that this political season will make us all feel quite humble. And with regard to economic assistance, I think you're absolutely right. Your last point was spot on. But you also hit on one of the reasons for this earlier in your presentation, that our economic contributions are primarily, though not exclusively, presented through the private sector.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for the US government to promote the private sector in a way that is acceptable to all segments of the American economic community, not to mention political community. So American economic activity is well known at the elite level, and you are absolutely right. Below the elite level, it's a bit mysterious. It's kind of a black box there of what we're about. Maybe the opposite of where we are on entertainment and things of that nature, where we're extraordinarily well known culturally for cultural reasons in the public, and maybe not always appreciated for our culture among elites. In any case, I wanted to go to something specific that was on your, if you don't count the slide that you didn't want to take credit for, your penultimate slide, and that is the South China Sea, because that is one place where US and China interests collide, where Southeast Asian interests are not singular in nature. They're a very diverse set of views on the South China Sea, but indeed it is a place where Southeast Asia, China, and the US do intersect, not just geographically, but in terms of potential violent conflict by intent or by accident or whatever. So I just wanted to ask you if you could comment a bit on the problem of these overlapping claims in the South China Sea, and whether we are headed towards a negotiated solution of some sort where the contesting parties can settle up, whether that is a bridge too far for the parties concerned, or maybe the standoff situation we're in is the best deal we can cut. I think everyone has to agree it's a dangerous space, and handling danger isn't always the strong suit of regional and global powers.
Yeah, it's a great question and something that, has been on my mind a lot, because we're seeing now nearly an endless cycle in China-Philippine escalations in particular. And I think, the negotiated solution might be difficult, but it's really the only choice we have, because it seems like we're increasingly sliding into potential for conflict. I think the difficulty there is the compromises that need to be struck are well known. Essentially, what you need is kind of a series of agreements between the various claimant states, so China, but also the 4 claimant states in Southeast Asia, so Brunei, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines, on things like fisheries, energy, for example. But these deals are very difficult to strike, and I think China in particular senses that it has an asymmetry of power. And so why cut a deal when, China is still rising in terms of its capabilities, and every 5 or 10 years, their ability to infringe into others' waters and dictate the terms increases over time. I think that's one track. I think the other track is just making sure that from an ASEAN or Southeast Asia perspective, there are these sort of ASEAN-China Code of Conduct negotiations that have been going on for decades, essentially. They're moving very glacially. But I think as with many things in ASEAN, progress is only part of what this process is designed to do. One of the things about this process as well is that it gives all of the Southeast Asian countries an idea that they have a stake in the South China Sea issue, which is the reality. I mean, this is a place where, you know, a significant proportion of world trade sort of passes through. If there were a conflict in the South China Sea, it would not just affect the Philippines. It would affect a lot of these Southeast Asian countries. So keeping that track alive is going to be very important.
Christina, do you have a comment or question you'd like to offer before we open up?
Yeah, I'd just like to kind of follow up on the security angle. So from the Southeast Asian countries' perspective, they do face a lot of kind of influence from China that often is security related. So for instance, with ASEAN declarations, there's often, you know, kind of pressure behind the scenes on countries to be sure that whatever statements come out related to the South China Sea issue are in China's favor. And beyond that, we've seen Myanmar incredible influence on the military and on other actors in the country. So what is your perspective on how Southeast Asian countries feel about this type of influence? And, you know, is that something they feel like, well, that's something we just have to accept given the advantages that we see or the lack of other opportunity? We have to get along with China because they're a big neighbor. How do you think they perceive it?
Yeah, I think it's a big question and a big concern, because for some of these particularly smaller countries, like say Laos, Cambodia, and Laos is chairing ASEAN this year, for example, they, you know, have less of a capacity, relatively speaking, compared to other countries in Southeast Asia, like say Indonesia, for example, you know, fourth largest country in the world, right? In terms of being able to manage some of these challenges. So, you know, there is a concern on that front. I also think a lot of this influence, as you pointed out, happens behind the scenes. So it's very difficult to actually say a lot of these things in public. So that's another challenge to actually figure out. Often, you know, you see a lot of headlines that will say, you know, the ASEAN statement, you know, said this, or it was, you know, too soft on this or too tough on this. But the ASEAN statements are actually the product of a lot of negotiations that go on behind the scenes. And a lot of major powers try to influence those discussions on particular issues down to individual lines, words, paragraphs, and so on and so forth. So you only get that perspective from talking to these countries who are under pressure in these situations. I do think there's a lot that other countries can do. You know, the US, Singapore, other countries have been engaged in, you know, capacity building discussions with these countries, not to influence particular issues, which is a separate thing, but really to increase their ability to be able to make their own decisions, irrespective of where they actually end up. And I think our ability to do that here in the US hinges on our confidence that if we allow countries in the region to make their own decisions, they probably will come along with some of the issues that we want, but not necessarily on all of those issues, and that's fine. Where I think countries get into trouble is when they try to affect the conversation to a particular outcome. Then all the countries start looking like China, and you can't really have a conversation about moral clarity when you are doing exactly the same thing as regions.
That's an excellent answer, and moral clarity is something that is in short supply in that region and most others. I'm gonna open now to your questions or comments. Please feel free to. Yes, I didn't even finish my sentence before I hand went up. That's great.
Graduate School of Engineering and also a former professor of computer science in the capstone course in engineering. My area of interest also is because my top secret full scope background, national security and artificial intelligence, generative AI. What's the U.S. Southeast strategy to control those areas in a meaningful way?
I mean, I think we're still in the kind of early phases in Southeast Asia on artificial intelligence. I think you see forward-leaning countries like Singapore, for example, being, you know, quite active in the space, not just actually in the Southeast Asia conversation, but also globally. As we think about AI norms, as we think about conversations around deep fakes, for example, that are also happening in the European Union. So Singapore, for example, played a leading role in the artificial intelligence framework that Southeast Asian countries just issued a few weeks back. But as many things in Southeast Asia, there is not just one reality. You know, so Singapore has its own sense of sort of a more global vision, more forward-leaning, a kind of lighter touch, relatively speaking, in terms of government interference, more private sector, a little bit more like our model. But there are countries in Southeast Asia that think that artificial intelligence needs to be more tightly regulated. And that this is something that is going to have significant effects, not just for the technology landscape, but also jobs, for example. And so that needs to be a conversation that's more tightly regulated. So I think we are starting to see that conversation play out in Southeast Asia, but it's still early days. I think the US is also doing a relatively good job under the Biden administration, starting these conversations with partner countries. So the US, one of the inroads the Biden administration made, that's probably one of the lesser known ones, is that they signed a very far-reaching technology agreement with Singapore last year. And that agreement is, I think there's only 4 countries that the United States has signed such a far-reaching technology agreement with. India, Israel, and South Korea, and Singapore is the 4th. And artificial intelligence is one of the key aspects of that platform for engagement. And so, that's a good example. I think with other countries like Vietnam, there might also be openings for that, because Vietnam thinks about its technology not as a commodity. So how can I buy this from Huawei, or how can I buy this? But it thinks about it more as an ecosystem approach, and it's trusted ecosystems. And so there is room for the United States and other partners to talk to these other Southeast Asian countries that are thinking about this in a more integrated way, rather than the conversation we were having a few years ago, where the US was, frankly speaking, seen as strong-arming certain Southeast Asian countries about not adopting this particular system or that particular system. And frankly, muddying the conversation, which is the real conversation, is around standards and trusted networks. It's not about, is China winning here today, or is China winning there tomorrow, right? And so I think keeping focus on that particular goal and bringing in other partners like Japan, the European Union, so on and so forth, is going to be really important.
AI is really a very interesting topic here. And one of the things that the people in Washington are especially concerned about when it comes to smaller countries that have self-perceived security threats is the opportunity that AI may offer to smaller states to become larger states in terms of military capability. That AI may allow some states to shortcut the way to a stronger position, very attractive to large states, but equally attractive to small states that don't want to invest a lot in hardware. So this chapter, the chapter of this book is just on the first sentence. Anyway, I'm sorry. Yes, there you go.
So my question is about the South China Sea.
And by the way, I heard by not saying, please introduce yourself first, then ask your
So
question.
Reese Bro, I'm a graduate student at GW, Director of ASEAN Affairs at OAS, Organization of Asian Studies. You wrote an ASEAN Wonk a few weeks ago about the development of a maritime sphere within ASEAN. This initiative seems to kind of come in contrast with the waning relevance of ASEAN, given the glacial movement of these code of conduct discussions. What do you see as the future of ASEAN in the South China Sea versus a more sort of minilateral approach with Japan, US, and Philippines?
Yeah, I think, it's a tough question, because as with many things, ASEAN has a role, but it has a role in a very sort of particular and limited sense, right? So when you talk about ASEAN, you're talking about, so 10 countries are members of ASEAN, and East Timor is on its way to becoming a full member. So we'll have 11, which is not quite a round number that we like. But essentially, the big issue in ASEAN is, how do you get 10 different countries to agree on a particular position? So in ASEAN, in the South China Sea disputes, you have 4 claimant countries. But what are the other 6 sort of think about this issue? And some of those 6, like say, Indonesia, for example, doesn't consider itself a formal claimant in the South China Sea disputes, but it has outstanding disputes with China. And so Indonesia plays a very active role in that. Other countries like Laos, for example, Laos is a landlocked country, so it doesn't really have a huge maritime stake. I mean, it needs to pay attention to that, but relatively less than, Indonesia, which, you're going to have a conversation about adequate capability for Indonesia to even monitor its own extensive waters is alone, a very kind of major preoccupation for Indonesia. So what you saw in that sort of ASEAN kind of maritime sphere declaration that came out, it was towards the tail end of Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN, and the chairmanship sort of rotates. And Indonesia, I think did a lot of things last year in the ASEAN context to prop up this idea of the maritime domain. Because I think from the way the Indonesians see it, if you're thinking about the Indo-Pacific and ASEAN's outlook and US-China competition, a lot of that is going to happen in the maritime sphere. And the South China Sea, as you pointed out, is a good example of that, but also the Indian Ocean, right? And other sort of maritime sort of bodies as well. And so the Indonesians tried to do that. They also set up the first ever ASEAN Maritime Outlook last year. So ASEAN is going to, every few years, try to produce this and get all of their mechanisms together. It's a important step because a lot of times there's a conversation about what ASEAN is doing with external partners, but frankly, a lot of the conversation is within ASEAN. There's so many mechanisms, a dizzying array of initiatives, but who's in charge of what? And, and how do you actually compartmentalize those things? It's a very difficult and challenging conversation to have. So I think that was a useful kind of way to come up with the declaration. The key issue is going to be under Laos's chairmanship, and Laos doesn't have as much of a stake, as I said, relative to Indonesia. What are we going to see on the South China Sea during Laos's chairmanship? And I think, if you're of a more skeptical mind in Southeast Asia and you have your expectations more managed, you would say, as long as we preserve what we have on the South China Sea as we did in 2023, and it doesn't sort of slip, that's fine. I think other people who are more ambitious would say, there should be an actual sort of clear delineation about how are we progressing on the ASEAN-China Code of Conduct talks. And I think that's still a little bit of a ongoing conversation because, as I said, this is a very diverse conversation that's very dynamic. So even as ASEAN countries are trying to shape their own conversation, China has included certain provisions in the COC negotiations, such as limits on military exercises by certain countries, including the United States, sort of informal veto over energy exploration that's conducted by Southeast Asian states by outside actors, which would include US companies. And so if that continues, that begs the question that a lot of Southeast Asian observers and analysts have been asking in the past few years, which is, is it better to have a less than ideal code of conduct or to not have a code of conduct at all? And I think from an ASEAN perspective, it's good to have that because you have a shared perspective on the issue. But at the same time, if you have these problematic provisions and it's hard to navigate those issues, you might see a bit more foot dragging, not because ASEAN doesn't know that it wants to finish this, but because finishing it might actually mean more challenges than actually muddying through over a period of time.
To follow up on that, do you see ASEAN as losing relevance over time as certain states, namely the Philippines, pivots outside assistance?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it all, relevance is in the eyes of the beholder, right? So if you look at ASEAN, so I always like to do a thought experiment, when I'm addressing questions like this. If you raise the founding fathers of ASEAN from the grave, and you brought them in here today, and you told them that every year you would have a conversation about whether the US president would be attending ASEAN-related meetings, and that ASEAN would be the Indo-Pacific convener, essentially, of choice, right? Whether by default or, or whether that is actually conferred on ASEAN is another question. I think they would be very surprised. This is not what ASEAN was supposed to be. In 1967, when ASEAN was founded, it was founded as an institution to kind of manage disputes within Southeast Asian countries. And Indonesia before that was, declaring war essentially over the existence of Malaysia and Singapore. And actually, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were on the other side. They weren't part of ASEAN. But over time, ASEAN has not only prevented major conflict from breaking out among the original 5 countries, but after the Cold War, they've included Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, healed the sort of divisions in Southeast Asia, and then in the 1990s and the 2000s, gradually built up the status of Indo-Pacific convener. So ASEAN has, by any stretch of the imagination, it has outpaced initial expectations. The question now is, has ASEAN sort of bitten off more than it can chew in terms of this Indo-Pacific convener status, taking on, kind of a role in managing the South China Sea disputes. And I think much of that is dependent on what these countries do themselves. And I think those questions are being asked, right, as we speak. I think the big question for these Southeast Asian states is, yes, if ASEAN is less relevant for US-China competition and South China Sea, that's one thing. But if ASEAN is disrupted to the extent that number of countries in Southeast Asia begin actually reviving disputes among each other and actually coming up with contentious points of discussion that used to be in the 1960s and the 1970s, and I still think we're far away from that. But I do think there is this fear and worries, if you talk to some diplomats and officials, of complacency in ASEAN, worries that, if ASEAN is too complacent about its role and is stuck in history, it's not going to be able to continue to serve this role, not for outside powers, but for actually countries within Southeast Asia. So a lot of times you hear in parts of Washington, ASEAN's got so many meetings, like over 1,000 here and there. Well, the meetings are not designed for, Washington to attend. I mean, Washington attends some of them. But the reason why these meetings have been successful is that they build confidence and habits of cooperation among these Southeast Asian countries themselves. So they don't, if you're engaging with your counterpart hundreds and hundreds of times across various bodies of government, that creates mechanisms and a culture of trust more so than it does over a period of decades. So I think even as we grade ASEAN on these geopolitical issues, South China Sea, US-China competition, which, I do that every week in my newsletter. So I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we should also keep in mind that there are also roles that ASEAN serves that are less talked about, but are still really important in terms of the original roles that its founders meant for it to serve.
Thanks.
Yes,
My name is Jessie Lin. I'm with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Economic Research Service. So I do research on trade and development. So given we had a major trade war between China and the U.S. in our last administration, how do you see Southeast Asian countries' role in this and the perspective looking forward, given that we may have another trade war between the two major powers?
Yeah, so you raise a point that actually I did not touch on in my presentation, so apologies for that. I think in terms of how the US and China are thinking about, sort of trade competition, economic competition, and how that factors into Southeast Asia, I mean, I do think that the Southeast Asians see some component of challenge in terms of what this means for them, kind of being, they're trying to work with both China and the US, right? So obviously, if China and the United States are competing, and the United States is coming to Southeast Asian countries and saying, why are you doing X and Y with China and not doing, A, B, and C with our partners, with us? That's a question. I also think though, I'm very struck. I mean, in this paper that I did for the Wilson Center, I traveled to all 10 of the Southeast Asian countries in the last, year and a half. The only country I wasn't able to make was Myanmar. So the situation there at the time, I didn't think it was wise to do it. But in all of these countries, there's also a remarkable amount of confidence in terms of the opportunities that come from US-China competition. Some of this is because of the actual dynamics. So if you look at, sort of companies and their China plus one strategies and their supply chains, they're looking at countries like Vietnam, for example, sometimes other countries like Malaysia, to kind of, they're not taking out their presence from China completely, despite what the headlines suggest, because China is a very important market. But they are coming up with other supply chains, and Southeast Asian countries stand to benefit from that. So whether it's critical minerals or semiconductors, for example, there is part of that equation where Southeast Asia sees opportunities. But frankly, the other dynamic and the other piece of that is that, frankly, a lot of the Southeast Asian countries have increasing dependence on China in particular, economically. And, the sort of case that gets a lot of attention is Laos, right? And the amount of, economic assistance and debt that they've taken on. Frankly, I had a chance to ride on the sort of rail service that China provided to Laos in terms of building this major rail that goes through some of its major cities. Yeah, I spoke to a student there, and her first reaction was, frankly, I'm very interested in your research and so on and so forth, but frankly speaking, the first thing I would say is that I've seen more of my country than I've ever had in my entire life, because this, if you go to Laos, some of the roads are really terrible. right? Not as bad as they were, say, 15, 20 years ago. And so when we think about China and its role in these countries, we tend to think about it as, sort of debt traps and Sri Lanka and so on and so forth. It's part of that. But there's also a part of it that China is actually building a lot of the infrastructure that lifts up people's sort of economic well-being. Now, the way in which China does that and the way in which governments engage China to do that might not necessarily always be high standards. It might not always be sort of in ways that are inclusive in terms of the consultation process with populations. But frankly speaking, as I said, I go back to the audience that I engage with when I go talk to these people, it's the policymakers. If you're the Indonesian president, you're trying to get a railway project built. You don't want a railway project built for your successor 15 years from now. You want to build it during your administration so you could take credit for it and then win re-election. And so if China comes to you and says, I'll build this railroad for you within 4 years, and another country comes to you and says, I'll do it in 20 years, which railroad project are you gonna get? And if you were in that position, what would you do, right? And so the big conversation in Southeast Asia is, how do you provide not just alternatives, but timely alternatives? So the standards conversation extremely important because we've seen projects that China is building and these large illegal scam networks that are really terrible in terms of forced trafficking and labor. But at the same time, it is also the case if you talk to people on the ground in Southeast Asia, they also appreciate that there is infrastructure that is being built today. And we're not talking about standards in 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And so we need to, as the United States, play the long game as well as the short game. And we have, I think, a very good long game narrative in Southeast Asia about lifting up standards, engaging young populations. But we also need to think about, and we are thinking about this in the Biden administration, about the Development Finance Corporation and how we can engage creatively in these countries and not tell them, oh, we'll come back to you in 7 years or 8 years. But what can you do now specifically and put money on the ground to get these infrastructure projects going? So that's also another part of the conversation that I think countries are talking about. One final thing I'll say, and I don't want to go on too long, but I want to just accentuate the point I made earlier that we have a very challenging conversation around trade in the United States, which, frankly, if you talk to people outside of Washington and outside of the two coasts, they think is long overdue because they don't feel like they've had as much of the benefits from globalization and these trade agreements. And frankly speaking, I'm not so sure how much our policymakers did 10 or 15 years ago to sell these agreements, not to the two coasts and not to Southeast Asian audiences, but to actually all of the 50 states in the United States. And we're doing a lot of that now, more so than we did, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But again, in the region, nobody stopped talking about trade. I mean, trade is huge in Southeast Asia and in the wider Indo-Pacific. You've got the CPTPP, which the US withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but now Japan has taken the lead. A number of Southeast Asian countries are part of that. You have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that the United States is not part of, but China is, and a number of other countries like Japan, Australia. That's now the largest free trade agreement in the world. And when you say that, you have to keep in mind that companies are really struck by how this affects supply chain linkages. What does it mean for moving their goods across particular countries? So when we say, for example, it's really tough for the US to have a free trade agreement with ASEAN. I hear this and, I understand that for the US policy, that is our view. But I would also say, if you look at our neighbor to the north, Canada, which is not exactly a developing country or looks anything like China, Canada is getting ready to finalize an agreement on free trade with ASEAN. And what does that mean if Canada has a free trade agreement with ASEAN? Our companies might be thinking very differently about how they move their products from the United States versus Canada versus Southeast Asia and RCEP and TPP, right? So we have our own conversation here in Washington, but I also think it's not a US-China or even a US and the region conversation. Our North American neighbors are also thinking very differently about trade and how they plug into these Indo-Pacific networks as well.
Yes. I'm sorry, let me go to this side of the room, a little gender balance. And then we'll come to you. Promise.
I'm Camilla Bailey. I'm with Radio Free Asia. I wanted to build up this question, or this, you kind of talked a little bit about How's it
Katie, can you speak up just a little bit so that corner can hear you?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Good.
You talked about how the Biden administration is kind of playing this long game, with ASEAN. Can you maybe reflect a little bit about how previous administration did this and how a future administration might look at long game versus short game in the ASEAN region?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I wanted to just say, I mean, Radio Free Asia continues to do tremendous work on getting out, particularly, I think, I still see some stories that, are including on, Chinese infrastructure projects and such, scam networks, that not often picked up as much by the traditional mainstream media, that Radio Free Asia is sometimes the only outlet where, including citations that I make in my ASEAN One newsletter. So thank you for all the work that you guys are doing as well. I would say on comparing administrations, I go back to my kind of earlier framework. And I would say, each administration, and, I don't have stakes here, because I'm not in a particular administration or didn't used to be in a particular administration, so I can say this. I mean, every administration kind of has its limitations, no matter what outlook it takes. So I would say, for example, in the Obama administration, the US was very invested in multilateral institutions, active on thinking about trade and economics. But I do feel like, particularly in the second part of the Obama administration, there were some frustrations among some Southeast Asian countries that the Obama administration wasn't taking the China challenge as seriously as it should in places like the South China Sea. And then you had the Trump administration, which took the China challenge very seriously, but then didn't show up as much in multilateral institutions and withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was still, I think, one of the major strategic own goals for the United States, if you look at the post-World War II order. And the US is still recovering from that. And now you have the Biden administration, which I think is doing a good job in terms of looking at these partnerships in a more flexible way. So elevating partnership with Vietnam last year, double upgrade, which is very significant for the United States. Signing a comprehensive strategic partnership with Indonesia. So not just talking to Thailand and the Philippines, our traditional allies, but building partnerships that are broader than that. I still do think, though, that as the United States, we could do a much better job of sort of building out our policy towards smaller Southeast Asian states, like, say, Brunei, Laos, Cambodia. Because I think for me, if I look at it from a perspective of just the strategic dynamics we have in front of us, if you're thinking about US-China competition, really you should be thinking more about the countries that are most vulnerable in that competition. And those happen to be the smaller countries. I mean, I am, frankly speaking, less worried about how Indonesia is going to manage US-China competition. I mean, Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. It doesn't need to be told that it needs to sort of balance and take care of Indonesia's interests. Indonesia is going to do what's best for Indonesia. But if you look at smaller countries like, say, Laos, I mean, they don't often have as many options because they don't have the size and the heft to do that. And so making sure the US works with other countries like Japan, European countries, so on and so forth, to provide these countries with more options and more agency to accentuate that is going to be really important. One other thing I would say is that the Biden administration, and I know President Biden himself, because he has, spoken about this very consistently throughout his career in the Senate, even before he became president. He really cares, in his bones about democracy and human rights. So no matter what Southeast Asian country A or B or C says about, you need to change how you're talking about democracy versus authoritarian regimes, I still think that's going to be a part of the Biden administration's agenda in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. But I do think it's really important for the Biden administration to keep emphasizing that this notion of values needs to be fit for purpose for Southeast Asia, right? Because if you look at Southeast Asia, East Timor is the most democratic country and it's outside of ASEAN, right? A lot of these countries are semi-democratic or authoritarian. You're not going to get very far if you start with the values conversation and you don't package it with something else that you're offering in terms of alternatives. So I still think the US could do a little bit more there. And then I think the final piece I would say is narrative. And I keep going back to this. Part of this is my own background in media, but I do think that the United States could do a much better job of telling the story of what it already does, rather than doing something new. And a lot of that is packaging what happens with the US government, with universities, with private sector, with companies, and sort of talking about, I mean, if I were to ask this room, can you summarize what the United States is offering Southeast Asia in 1 or 2 words? It's difficult. I wrote a piece for the Diplomat recently, and I mentioned, Japan has answered that question, right? Japan came out during its statement last year, its commemorative summit with Southeast Asia. It said, the narrative we're pushing is we're a trusted power. That is what we're going to provide to the region. So what does that look like for the United States? I mean, the argument I made in the piece that I wrote for the Diplomat recently was that the United States should make the case that it is a networked power. That is the strength of the United States. So no matter how dysfunctional Washington is, and you can talk about this for forever, you can talk about it in the 1800s and the 1900s, a similar conversation. But what happens outside of Washington, companies, universities, what young people are doing to reshape the environment, local governments, and so on and so forth, that reflects the dynamism of the United States. And if we don't promote that conception of a network power, we're going to keep talking about the dysfunction in Washington every election. Every election cycle now, and in Southeast Asia, I unfortunately spend a lot of time. People ask me questions about U.S. domestic politics, and I quickly say I have no expertise, and I'm glad I don't have expertise in U.S. domestic politics. But I don't have to talk about that stuff. We can talk more about geopolitics and what goes on in Southeast Asia, but there are a lot of worries and anxieties. And so we need a narrative to be able to take us through these very challenging domestic political times that doesn't have to do with just Washington, that has to do with the US as a broader actor.
So,
Yeah, I sort of have 2 questions. You talked about how.
I am,
Oh, Mitchum. My name is Mitchum Callahan. I'm a 2nd-year graduate student in the Asian Studies program here at GW. Yeah, you referenced that ASEAN is not as interested in political competition in terms of the US-China binary. I was curious if the kind of ideal goal for ASEAN and their regional viewpoint is that they hopefully become a more autonomous kind of bloc that is more economically competitive from maybe a national perspective in each country. And then my other question is, how does ASEAN view sort of the shifting reality in Myanmar right now and great power involvement in that region?
So, sorry, the last part was Myanmar and great power.
Yeah, how do they view great powers that are near Myanmar and the shifting realities in the region?
Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up those sort of questions, because when I look at Southeast Asia and that kind of narrative, and I grew up in Southeast Asia, right? So I was born in Malaysia, lived in different countries. My dad was a journalist, working through the region before I came to the US. And I'm really struck. I mean, if you look at the region today, and you talk to officials, you go out, you talk to younger people who are even not part of the elite circles, I do sense there's a lot more confidence in Southeast Asia about the region and country-based narratives, rather than just thinking about, oh, the US is descending on us or China is descending on us. And I think that is definitely a point at which these countries are thinking about it. So I'm not sure about an autonomous bloc, because the capacity constraints in some of these Southeast Asian countries are quite significant. And the divisions among these countries will also still exist. But I do think that would be the desirable end goal for Southeast Asia, to sort of promote itself as kind of a, not part of a US bloc or a China bloc, but really bringing all the powers sort of together, a convening space, if you will, right, within the Indo-Pacific, to bring in Japan, the European Union, right, Australia, all of these countries, China, US, to be part of that conversation. I do think that is part of it. The big challenge for Southeast Asia in that space is that a lot of things keep happening around the world. Professor Weiss referenced this in his introductory comments, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, which has, I can safely say in some of the US relationships, I was in Malaysia a few months ago, it was very difficult to talk about anything except the situation and our policies specifically with respect to Israel and Gaza, the war that's going on there. Now, of course, if you walk to the Israeli embassy here in Washington, DC, and you see the protesters that are out there, and you see the debate that we have among our younger people, among both our political parties, I think it also obscures the fact. Sometimes we hear the US is so supportive of Israel and so on and so forth, but apart from Washington's policy, we are having, I think, our own larger debate in the United States about how to deal with these problems. And that's a very diverse and contested debate. And so when I'm in the region, I also am very careful to point out to interlocutors that, when you talk about a US position, I mean, there's a Washington position and a Biden administration position. But to suggest that, just like we said, that in Southeast Asia, it's, 700 million people, 11 different countries, there's, 50 states in the United States, diverse opinions across the board. I think it's also, and all of us have a job here and a role to play when we talk to interlocutors to keep emphasizing the point that, even at the State Department, there are people who are, this is all public, people who are leaving their posts. There's a dissent channel, which Secretary Blinken has talked about, where people are contributing to. That's the great thing about the United States, right? We can have these debates and conversations openly, but sometimes if we don't portray that in a particular narrative and we don't make it clear to other countries, it can seem like there's one US position and then when an administration comes in, there's another position. When actually the position of the United States is always very diverse and extremely dynamic. So I think that's another piece of the conversation. I think Professor Fink will probably be able to comment a lot more on Myanmar than I would in terms of the great power competition or major power competition. But I actually see Myanmar as being, I mean, this is one of the tragic stories. Whenever Myanmar gets into a situation like this, we, as the US, sometimes we're very engaged, and other times when countries go to situations like this, we're not engaged at all. And other countries like China and Russia will be very engaged. And the conversation for the people of these countries is still wanting more choices and more engagement with the outside world. So for the question for me is, if we're talking about Myanmar in 5 or 10 or 15 years, will we have created an environment where people's aspirations in countries like Myanmar are still being advanced, even as we oppose what the government is doing? And that's a very challenging conversation, but I think it's one which the United States will have to be very creative, and US actors, not just US government, but universities, individuals, companies will have to think very strategically about their role in this conversation, because it's a very contested and frankly very sad reality that's happening in Myanmar right now in terms of the tragedy in the country. And the South China Sea is one which we talk about a lot. There's a lot of strategic dynamics, a lot of geopolitics. But I feel like of the two regional flashpoints that get attention in Southeast Asia, Myanmar and the South China Sea, Myanmar often has a tendency to get forgotten after a few years. We've got Myanmar, and then we've got Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Gaza, and now the conversation on Myanmar, I feel like, is not used to be in the front pages, or at least it's there's a story in there. Now it's kind of, we're increasingly being numbed to it, and that's pretty worrying. And we got to a similar position in the South China Sea, by the way, 10 years ago, when New York Times and the Washington Post carried frontline pages about China's artificial island building strategies in the South China Sea. South China Sea now has been relegated to the back pages. Now, China Philippines has put it on the radar screen, but if that goes away, we're back to where we are. So sustaining that focus is going to be really important.
Although we don't really have time for it, I think we can sneak in one more question if someone has one. There is one right there. Yes, sir.
You're going to talk about like partnership.
I am.
Sorry, my name is Timothy. I'm a junior here at Elliott School, majoring in international affairs. And I'm actually like originally from Indonesia, so I just have interest in anything Southeast Asia. But more of a general question, you kind of mentioned about US like partnerships, and recently there's been, I guess, an increase of defense partnership between US and the Philippines. What future do you see with like other Southeast Asian nations in terms of partnerships and alliance with the United States? Do you think it's realistic for them to kind of maintain like a robust yet balanced relationship with both powers, the US and also China? Yeah.
I like the way you frame that question, because Indonesia, and you probably know better than me, being from the country, it's so striking. I mean, you now have a likely new president, Prabowo, who is somebody who's very, he's a known quantity, but sometimes has unpredictable views. So it's under Jokowi, Indonesia had this sort of essentially outlook where it was a very kind of mostly domestic focused and economic focused foreign policy. And a lot of that, I don't think Jokowi himself was, pro anyone, pro China or pro US. But because there was that economic focus, Indonesia ended up doing a lot more with China. And some of the economic initiatives that Indonesia sought from the United States, like on critical minerals, the Indonesians were quite disappointed that Washington was not able to provide that very quickly. But at the same time, the security relationship between the United States and Indonesia has deepened. It already was quite significant, and now it's gotten even more significant. And, the exercises like Garuda Shield, for example, that were bilateral have now been multinationalized with other countries. So a big question is, what does a country like Indonesia do with Prabowo, who may have, much more expansive sense of geopolitics and foreign policy? I think the fundamental structural realities, if you're looking at Indonesia, it's a country that is looking to become essentially a developed economy by 2045. You're going to need some assistance from China, but also some assistance from Japan, other countries to balance that. But on the security side, the US is still kind of the major game in town. If you look at military exercises, the Lowy Institute recently did the math on this from 2021 to 2023. The US accounted for a third of all military exercises in Southeast Asia during that period, right? So the US, in terms of the security game, is going to be quite significant. But even there, I would say, Japan is doing a lot more. Australia is doing a lot more. And so I would look for countries like Indonesia, but also other countries in the region. They're finding a lot more security partnerships from other countries as well. And China is also in that game, because despite what China says, we're only an economic power, and every country, including the United States, says the same thing, and they go on to become a security power. So China is also doing a lot more in the security realm, more exercises. And so I suspect we will see some Southeast Asian countries do more with China on the security side.
Well, thank you very much. I regret that we've reached the end of our time, but the truth is that we have. I want to, well, first thank Prashanth for a wonderful presentation. Please join me. I hope that most of you can get credit for a mini course as a result of his work here today. Second, I want to thank Professor Steele, who couldn't be here, but Professor Fink, who is here, for facilitating the whole thing, for making this possible. Could not have been done without you and Adam's help as well. So thank you very much. And lastly, you can keep clapping for yourselves because you have been a great audience and we really appreciate you taking time out to join us today. Don't forget March 26th, we're going to talk about Myanmar about the same time, for about the same length of time. And it's going to be really fascinating conversation led by Professor Finn. So with that, have a great rest of the day and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.